evening. It is the June 10, 2024 Lower Makefield Planning Commission meeting. My name is Anthony Bush. I'm appearing remotely, and I can't see who's present right now. I do believe that Colin Coyle is not present tonight, and it looks like the other three members are present, if I'm not mistaken.
We're here.
All the other members are present, besides Colin.
Okay, good. Thank you. First item on our agenda is the approval of minutes from the May 13, 2024 meeting. Does someone want to make a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any comments or concerns about the minutes? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And the motion passes. Next item is something that was before us at our last meeting, the accessory structure ordinance discussion. And I think either Jim or Dan, you want to pick up with where we left off on this?
Thank you, Tony. I have up on the screen for you a draft of kind of a synthesis of what we had spoken about at the prior meeting. We broke it out into two different standards, one for the R1 and RRP zoning districts, where the lots tend to be slightly larger, and then another one for the R2, R3, R3M, and the R4 zoning districts, where the lots typically are somewhat smaller. The key points in the ordinance would be that the accessory building or structure shall not be permitted in the front yard. They are required to be behind the back building line of any dwelling. Sheds shall be no closer than 5 feet from any side or rear property line for the R1 and RRP zoning district, and larger accessory buildings greater than 200 square feet, which would be something like a 10 by 20 shed or a 14 by 14. Those larger ones would be the 10 feet that we currently have in the standards away from the property line. And the maximum height of the structure stays at 15 feet as it currently is. For the R2, R3, R3M, and R4 zoning districts, the only difference would be that the shed should be no closer than 3 feet from any side or rear property line. That'll give enough room in the yard for someone to be able to enjoy it with a smaller lot size while still maintaining enough room around the structure to properly maintain it, paint it, cut the grass, etc. And once again, they would also have any larger structures would be required to be the 10 feet off with the maximum height of 15 feet. And the building's required to be behind the back building line of the residential structure. So I think that kind of sums up what the sort of the consensus was. I know there was a little bit of wrangling over what exact number to use in each of these, but if anyone has any comments, it'd be great.
Not to reopen it again after we discussed it last meeting, but, you know, driving around, you notice there's a lot of people who have these sheds.
I'm not able to hear you.
Yeah,
right now very
I got to
well.
get closer. Okay. Okay, I'll do that. Thank you. No problem. A lot of people have their sheds on their driveway. So is it possible to consider it has to be behind the front of the structure as opposed to behind the structure? I mean, a lot of people like to have their two-car garage, and then across from it, there'll be a, you know, I'm not talking about changing the setbacks, but, you know, across from their garages on the concrete or the asphalt, they put up a shed. And it's not behind the property, it's kind of contiguous with the property or, you know, behind the front. Just a thought.
Like that's one I can, as long as it's not the, I mean, there's probably some engineering technical stuff that'd be a better way to articulate this, but it just feels like to me if it's behind the front of the house, if it's not the primary visual structure, and you do some landscaping, whatever, maybe to at least not make it look like a big box in the middle of your yard, I don't necessarily see a problem with it having to be behind the structure, but I just don't think it should be in front of the structure.
Would you then say it would be equal kind of to the back of the structure? It would have to be,
Yeah,
I guess.
yeah, I would just
the
say
end of it.
behind the front of the
No far
structure.
forward than the front of
The
the
front.
main structure.
That's fine.
Yes,
Any
so-
thoughts,
so-
Tony?
Yeah, no, I'm okay with that. I think as long as it doesn't go in front of the structure, I agree with that.
Yeah, so we could just amend that by taking out the word back building line and just say located behind the building line of the residential dwelling. I think that would convey the intent there. Does that make sense?
And that would be the whole structure, correct? So no structure could be in front?
The whole,
Is that what you're
the
trying
whole
to say?
structure has to be behind the front of the
Behind the
house.
front line.
Right.
That seems to make sense. It seems to address the concern.
I'm sorry, Tony, could you
Yeah,
repeat
Tony, you
that?
keep like cutting
I
in
said,
and
I think
out.
that seems to address the concern that was raised.
Did you have something first?
Yeah, I was going to ask, what's the specific definition of residential accessory building, and does it include ADUs or accessory dwelling units as part of that?
It does not. I can look that up for you real quickly.
So are ADUs specifically prohibited in this particular instance?
Yeah, they are prohibited everywhere, but I'll look up the definition so we can see exactly what it says.
The reason I ask the question is there may be, unfortunately, where we're at with the stormwater issues that we have, ADUs are probably not an opportunity for many of the parcels in Lower Makefield, but for some, they could provide additional housing support, especially for family members that are looking for that. And so, to me, the difference between a shed and a tiny house or ADU or what have you is, visually essentially the same in most cases. And I wouldn't want to have a building type expressly prohibited when it maybe shouldn't be. But
That's a really good point for me. You're just sort of assuming shed in this discussion, but we ought to make sure that that's essentially what we're talking about, right? In the letter of it.
Yeah, and I have up on the screen the definition of an accessory building or structure, and that is a building or structure subordinate to and detached from the main building on the same lot and used for purposes customarily incidental to those in the main building, including but not limited to private non-commercial greenhouses, farm buildings, swimming pools, tool sheds, playhouses, and detached garages. So, and we have like dwelling units, that only one dwelling unit is allowed on any one lot. You're not allowed to have more than one dwelling unit, so you couldn't have an accessory dwelling unit.
So if I had an accessory building that was a two-car garage, and we've seen these where they're higher, many times they're higher because they want to put a lift in for the car or something like that. But if it had a second floor, or even if it was so large that I could parcel one of the garages as like, a small apartment for a family member or something like that. I'm not saying that based on any personal needs or anything like that. So far, knock on wood, we haven't had any returns yet. But I kid. But I just think that there may be cases where that can be particularly helpful for families in different circumstances.
And I wasn't even thinking of garages.
Based on what you just said earlier, it sounds like that's not permitted.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's something if the Board of Supervisors and the Planning Commission think that that's something worthy of pursuing, we obviously could look into that as a future amendment.
I think if we're to go ahead and change this ordinance right now, or recommend approve to the supervisors to make this change, then in the future, if this ADU were to come before the supervisors, I think this would need to be revisited.
Yeah, I think it would just be what's presented today, and then the ADU, and the ADU, I think, is a bigger picture to talk about, and then we could always amend it to make it allowable in, certain parts of the township. But currently, anywhere that's zoned residential is just for one dwelling. But I think an ADU is a very pragmatic way to increase density smartly with the existing housing structure in the township. I also think it provides a realistic alternative for, people who want to downsize where, the current market doesn't really allow for them to do so in certain parts of the township. So I do think it's a good, trend in planning. But essentially, I guess what's in front of us today would just be what Jim has on the screen, the sheds and the, all that.
All right. I have a couple of points. One, I was just thinking I might poke holes in the thing we just talked about before. But what happens in neighborhoods where the houses aren't sort of symmetrical in terms of distance from the street? So now we're giving permission to essentially go in an R2, if we do this, giving permission to go 3 feet from the property line, and the house that's doing that, like even with the front of the house, but it could be 40 feet in front of another house. So now the person in the other house is looking at the back of a shed. I'm again, like I said before, I'm trying to poke holes in this so we don't run into the actual issue later. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, like flag lot kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like we've reviewed these lots in different projects where people are subdividing into 2 or 3 lots where, you have like almost a shared driveway with different houses, and now all of a sudden you could have, like, look at the street, you don't even see one of the houses because you have a shed right in the way.
No, I get what you're saying. I think you're going to have far more cases where requiring it to be in the fourth of the lot furthest removed from the road, like way in the back,
Yeah.
is more detrimental to residents than the few cases where you have someone with an odd setback that their house is set so far back behind everything else.
Yeah, I'm just trying to make sure we're not helping create issues between neighbors.
Right.
That's really what a lot of this comes down to, right?
Yeah.
Adrian, it almost sounds like if we leave it the way it is, there's an issue, and if we change it, we're creating an issue, but for other people, just shifting a problem, but it might be a smaller subset of people that have a problem.
Yeah, like, I guess I'm still a little bit, I think I understand the problem statement, but I'm still not sure what the problem statement actually is. What are we trying to solve? Because we have, like, even when we're kind of learning about this, we have a problem, one, where it's unnecessarily, people think it's unnecessarily inconvenient for a lot of residents in the township that want to have these things in terms of the way it's written today. But, if everything was sort of starting right now, we had a process that asked for variance based on this stuff, wouldn't be a big deal, but we have probably a lot of out of specification accessory structures around the township. And if we start doing that now, we probably need, if we start coming down on this or whatever, we also probably need to start doing something about things that are out of spec.
That's one of the reasons why I want to make this amendment to
When we're
make
done,
it
you'll have
more
time to
compliant with what the reality is of people. We have, I've seen it actually on even friends' yard. I go out and say, well, their shed's not really compliant with our ordinance. I didn't go look up to see whether or not they got a variance. They could have in the past. I'm not aware, but I look at it and it's just like they're closer to the property line than the 10 feet,
Yeah.
or they're not in that fourth of the lot. No one's ever complained. Could be they got a variance, I don't know, but having hundreds and hundreds of nonconformities for something that the zoning hearing board routinely grants the variance
Right.
for, just creates a burden for people having to shell out the money to get a variance. And also, at the same time, we bear a burden as a township too, because the cost for a zoning hearing board hearing is like split between them. So every time we have a hearing, it costs us some money. So it behooves us to right-size our ordinance to be what
So is.
works.
Is the primary reason the zoning hearing board would grant the variance essentially because of precedence and the inconvenience for the property owner?
A little bit of that sort of
Yeah.
thing, yeah.
Okay.
Jim, just to rephrase what Adrian's asking a little bit, what percentage of these zoning, the request for zoning relief, how often is it not granted? In terms of a percentage.
It's seldom not granted. There has to be a real overriding reason why they don't grant it.
How far, and like, I guess here's another question, for the zoning hearing board, what do they, like, is there any sort of information on, okay, so it's not, so they're giving a variance from the 10 feet or the back quarter of the lot, like, what have they been granting it to? They gotta be obviously putting some limits around it, right?
I think most of the time, it's like somebody will submit a variance for a pool, and then they're looking at when we're looking at the plan, we notice that the shed is non-compliance, and then they would have to get a variance for it. So a lot of times, they're essentially granting a variance for something that's either already there.
Right.
Would you agree with
Yeah,
that?
yeah,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
what
And,
is, like,
the-
like, okay, so somebody's building a pool, and they want to put a pool house, or a pump house, or whatever. So it's inside the 10 feet, they're giving a variance on 10 feet. They're not allowing default that person to go up to 0 feet, right? No,
No.
what are they, what is sort of their unspoken limit that they're willing to go with?
One of the most recent ones was they granted the variance to be 3 feet off of one property line, 5 feet off of another. And that's because that's where it was placed. So they felt 3 feet is kind of a good minimum, in that gives you adequate room to maneuver around the building, to paint it, to replace,
Yeah.
replace a cedar shake, to cut your grass around it.
Okay. Yeah, I still have to, look, I can't speak personally to all of I think I live in R2. So like, I don't know enough about what all the various lot sizes are and what constraints we're dealing with. But I feel like for my neighborhood, I feel like 3 feet is for allowing it automatically. I get there might be circumstances where, okay, you talk to neighbors and you go through the process to get the variance, like 3 feet may be okay. I get that it's not never okay. But to carte blanche, that feels too close to me. It just does. And I can't give you some engineering school answer to that, but it feels too close, and I can't speak to everything, and I gotta turn to you, like, for some of the master planning things with the R3 and R4 and all that kind of stuff. There might be different sort of things, and there's other things we also have allowed in those things that may be fine. So I'm not sitting here trying to make a carte blanche statement to everything. I could just speak my experience.
I get it. It's kind of hard to like quantify too, like the right setback for something like this, but
Yeah.
also too, and this might be a de minimis point, but just because it's 3, someone personally might want to do 4 or 5. So I think that's just setting the absolute, bare minimum for the setback for the 3 feet.
Yeah, and I guess my mindset is, okay, so it sounds like, just based on the history of this township, it probably shouldn't be 10 foot. We're just talking about setbacks right now.
Right.
It probably shouldn't be 10 feet. But
Yeah.
I'm still thinking 5 feet and 3 feet is not enough. That's my personal opinion.
No, and that's
First, doesn't mean we don't allow it, right? But
Right.
but at that point, if you want to go to 3 feet, you should have to go to the township and ask for it. That's my opinion.
So to get a
You shouldn't
variance.
just be able to put it there automatically without going to process and dealing with your neighbors who you may or may not have a relationship with and making sure everyone's okay with it.
What does everyone else think?
I agree. I agree. I think that's I mean, personally, I think for a shed, something that's a small improvement to your lot, I think that's a lot of hurdles to make someone go through, but I get what you're saying.
So, and, maybe we create a process internally for, I don't know, maybe, I'm making it more complicated, so I know we don't.
Well, see, that's what we're trying to do, not make it more complicated.
But,
Because right now, it's
sometimes-
so overly complicated,
But-
it's basically a burden to,
Maybe we're
township
making,
and
maybe this
residents.
part's becoming complicated because we oversimplified it by calling every structure that's not part of the house an accessory structure and trying to force fit the same answer on all of them. So maybe it might be okay for a garage, or it might not be okay for a shed, or it might be a little doghouse you want to put for your dog or whatever. I mean, we're trying to call everything one thing, it might not be.
well, if you, let me share the screen again. If you're looking at what we put down, the larger ones we're calling out as still requiring 10 feet.
Okay.
I-
Right, that's true.
I
12
also-
by, so essentially 20 by 10. But you could put a garage up that's 20 by 10, right?
Yes.
Small garage.
Yeah. I also think too, I think it was good that someone brought up the building line, because say if your house is, say if the side setback for your house is 25 feet, and you want to put it closer to your house, like John mentioned, and it really, no one's going to put it 3 feet from the side of their house. They'd be putting it much closer to their house. So it could be like 15, 20
no,
feet.
that's-
No, but I think that, like, wording it the way we have it with the building line would do the opposite of what you're saying. I think more people would be putting it closer to the house, because that's an option now, but, or it could be, but I got what you're saying.
So I personally would be inclined with, like, I'm not opposed to the idea of re-looking at this stuff from a township standpoint. I'm just trying to create debate here.
Well,
And maybe the numbers we selected aren't the right numbers, and the change ought to kind of meet halfway and say, hey, we'll cover most of these things, not make it overly burdensome on most residents and the staff of the township, but still create a line where, okay, if we're starting to get pretty close to neighbors, getting close to other neighbors' property lines, or township property lines, or whatever it is, there has to be at least a discussion.
Yeah, do we have any thoughts, like from Tony? Do you want to make it bigger than 3 feet? Make it 5, and, or do you are okay with 3?
Showed up on the screen there said 5 feet, right? It didn't say 3 feet, correct?
That was 5 feet for the R1 and the RRP, 3 feet for the R2, 3, and 4,
Yes.
where the lot sizes are typically smaller.
Okay, and from what you gave, what we were provided before the last meeting showed neighboring towns were typically 3 to 7 feet. And I agree, 3 feet seems too little a distance, especially if you get sort of back-to-back sheds, or maybe even 3 sheds all in close proximity to one another, on adjoining properties. It can be a lot if they're that close to the property line.
So do you have a preference for another number? 4 feet, 5 feet?
I would think at least 5 feet. I mean, I can see 10 feet might be a lot, and I know that when we spoke before, I don't know if it was you, Jim, or Dan, but one of you were saying that really 2 of the drivers here were, for making this change, were on long lots, the sheds being way in the back of the property, and, long, narrow lots really far back. And on smaller lots, with the requirements that we had, sometimes the shed was almost in the middle of the backyard, which also isn't great for anybody either. I'm thinking 5 feet, 5 feet for both, for everything that you just talked about. Or maybe we have 7 feet for the larger properties and 5 feet for the smaller properties. But I agree with Adrian that 3 feet sounds too small. Not saying that there's too short a distance. Not saying that it's not given by the zoning hearing board, but at least somebody has to come before the township.
Yeah,
and
we
explain
have a
why.
discussion about it, and like if it goes to zoning hearing board, the neighbors have an opportunity to have a voice into what they think about it, and, okay, if I'm gonna allow this, then is there gonna be some landscaping around it, is there gonna be like, have that discussion? I think that's just neighborly. And we're help facilitating it.
I just look at, we have hundreds and hundreds of sheds, non-compliant. Typically, they put them about 3 feet off the property line with, I don't think we've ever had a complaint about a shed being close to the property line.
I know one, but-
But once it's there, it's there. It's hard to remove them.
There are cases where very close to the property line would be advantageous for the neighbors as well. So if you, and
Yeah,
that's
what
where.
I'm not saying we say
Yeah.
no to it.
Yeah, that's, and like, if you had a fence in your backyard and the neighbor wanted to put something 3 feet from the fence, you probably wouldn't care.
Yeah.
And so that's where this trade-off is where do you,
So I understand it. I understand the reality of the township is, from a setback standpoint, 10 feet carte blanche is probably not the right answer. That's, I get, it seems like that's a pretty strong consensus. But that, so that's why, again, I'm going back to, okay, so if we start cutting that back, let's get it to some sort of normal situation.
Well, it looks like we have 2 people for 5 feet. We have 2 other members. What do you guys think? 3 feet, 5 feet, 10 feet?
So what happens with the existing structures that are there now? Is that,
We're going to have to make people start moving sheds.
so do we put, is there language then to say anything going forward from this revision? Anything that's already in place? that's-
Well, if it's grandfathered in, they're fine,
I'm not-
but anyone,
I feel strongly about this. This is not a policing discussion.
well,
Because
it is
right
in
now,
that
if
we can't
decide
police
nothing
what
right
people
now-
aren't
If we
doing.
decide nothing right now, we have to start doing it anyway. Because right now, it's out of spec. You're telling me there's a lot of stuff that's already out of spec with what we have. And so what I'm trying to have a discussion here is what we want.
Oh, I
If there are
agree.
things out of spec with that, I understand that that's a problem for the township. That's not necessarily planning commission's not here to just sort of like wipe away all of the sins of the township from the past and just come up with something that's easy for everybody. That's not our job. I don't think it is.
Well, I'd like to know what the other 2 members think. 3 feet, 5 feet, more feet?
I'll take the middle, 5, I think is.
Okay.
I think 5 gives at least something.
Yeah, and I'm okay with 5. I'm
Yeah.
just saying, the argument for 3 has some thought behind it. It's not just I picked a number out of my hat
Yeah.
and said, let's go with 3. That
Yeah.
sounds
No,
fine.
And
Yeah.
I understand, and I hope you're not taking me wrong, like, I'm not opposed to this concept, but we need to
Right.
sort of hash this stuff out, is my point. It shouldn't just be an easy, okay, 3 feet, whatever, like, we should think about it.
Yeah, I agree. I think 5 is reasonable.
So if that's the case, does someone want to make a motion to put forth that amendment as discussed?
Well, we changed the,
Yeah, what do we,
we
let's,
changed the language to the front of the building, right?
Yeah, let me call it up real quickly, sorry.
Behind the, whatever terminology.
Yeah, it's good to be able to,
For all of the, for both sections, the R1 and RP, and the R2, R3, R3M, and R4?
correct. So now it's going to be sheds maybe no closer than 5 feet for any zoning district. For smaller ones, for larger ones, it's 10. And then we changed it to be no accessory buildings shall be located, or they may be located behind the building line of the residential dwelling. So not the rear of the building, but the building
So
line.
I'll make a motion to accept that with the 2, what was written with the 2 changes, meaning the 5-foot change and the front of the building line.
and I just want to make sure.
Just so I'm clear, it's 5 feet for
So we're saying there's a.
5 and 7?
Sorry. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Tony. You kind of break up a little bit when you talk, so we missed the first word.
I wanted to be clear, is it 5 feet for both of the both paragraphs that you just showed up on the screen?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess I just want to make sure we're talking about, so we don't want to do anything for R1, RRP, or 1 acre lots, or half acre, 3/4 acre lots, or whatever. We just want to say carte blanche now. It's not different by zone, it's just 5 feet.
Yeah, the only difference would be a larger setback is required for a larger structure. When you go beyond
Yep.
what is considered a normal shed
Right.
or smaller building.
Okay. So we're saying anything more, 5 feet or greater away from the property line, under 200 square feet, less than 15 feet tall, you essentially, I mean, you don't have to ask for anything, you just fill out your permit, pay your $35 and it's done. So, and so that's okay with my colleagues here.
So I think John made a motion.
Yep, okay, go ahead.
I'll second it.
And we did have public comment,
Is there any
I saw.
discussion? Any further discussion on the pending motion?
Yeah, we actually have someone for public comment here.
Is there any, I think we're probably done with our
Yeah,
comments.
no, there's public comment though.
Public comment. Yeah, sure. Marco Vietti, Yardley. I think I'm an R1, I'm not sure. But I think the one thing that, on that front building line, what do you do when houses are diagonal on a lot?
Oh, that's a good point, yeah.
So now if the front building line is diagonal, that thing's gonna sit in someone's driveway. Gotta be careful about the building line thing.
Right.
You need
Okay.
to accommodate, because there are many neighborhoods, and I was here a year ago when my neighbor wanted to put a shed in the front of his house. Many of you may remember that, which this would allow him to do that.
Right.
Well, not really, because if you say no closer, it's gonna, you have to look at the furthest
So
back
he'd be
of the
5
line,
feet,
right?
so his front of his house would be
No, I'm not talking
diagonal.
about setback, I'm
No,
talking,
his diagonal front of the house would then go, and the way it's diagonal, it's gonna hit my neighbor's.
Yeah, we need to define that.
It's
better.
gonna be now 30 feet from the road, because his house is diagonal. It's gonna be 5 feet from the corner. You better look at
I
diagonal,
think-
because there's many, many diagonals.
I
Thank
think-
you.
I think the simple way
Yep.
to address that concern would be no further front than the
Neighbors?
closest. In other words, if your house is on a diagonal, right, and, you know, the right side of your house is, 50 feet from the road and the left side is 30 feet, it's got to be the front that's
Right.
further back.
Well, we actually,
It's gotta be further back from the street
Right.
than whatever the closest point to the street is.
well, we do have in the ordinance that it's not permitted in front yards. So
Yeah,
he
but
could
he's bringing
not
up
put
an
it in
interesting
the front
point.
yard.
You guys just have to remember, I'm just saying, there's a lot of houses that are diagonal. If it's the front building, someone's gonna take a line, strike it across their yard.
I think the way you described
Well,
it.
the way he described it was no further
No, but-
forward till, in other words, it has to be at least as far as the closest point to the street.
Yes.
I think is your point.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
Then that would draw a parallel line to the street.
Yes.
A 45 line to his garage, essentially.
Yeah.
That would be where you could put it.
Is that,
Yes.
can we do that, Jim?
You understand what we're saying?
I understand and I agree. I'm just trying to figure out how to
How
word
to
that.
say it? That was a good point, it was a good point, I did not even think about that.
I just remembered that, Rob.
It's an issue that we should address in this motion.
Well, maybe we should take a look at that and come back to the next meeting. How's that sound? For that wording. Sorry.
That's all right. It's better to get it right than to get it done.
We do want to clearly define that, because that could cause
Yeah.
problems.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you raised a good issue on that.
The other thing I was thinking with that is for the houses that have the garage that comes even more forward than the entryway of their house. So it might be 20 feet closer to the road. Do we want to allow it still up closest to where the garage comes forward or where
Yep.
the back front portion of the house?
Well, I could bring forth several samples
Yeah.
of what it
And I
would
can-
look like with
yeah, I can-
wording of how we could address the concern, which is pretty good. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Yeah, we
All
figured it
right,
out.
so
I think you
we'll,
need your
How about-
mic on. I don't think you can hear.
No,
Was your mic on?
No further forward than the closest, from the farthest point from the street of the main structure.
Yeah, I don't want to really do it on the fly right now,
Yeah,
because I looked at, we have a definition for building line, which worked perfectly, except for the case that cited that could be misconstrued, and I don't want it to be an argument over an interpretation when it should be
I agree.
clearer.
Let's take a look at it and we
Let's
can.
get this right. Somebody want to make a motion to table this agenda item till the next meeting?
Yeah,
I'll make the motion.
painful, but.
Table it till
I'll
next
second it.
meeting. We got a second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Next item on our agenda is the stormwater management ordinance amendments, the discussion. Jim, do you have a PowerPoint? We're going
Yeah.
to show or is this Dan? Okay.
Sharing my screen, just want to confirm that it is. Yep. All right, well, good evening, everyone. I am Jonathan Robinson. I am a civil engineer with Herbert Roland and Grubik, HRG, and tonight I will be discussing the stormwater management ordinance revision recommendations to Lower Makefield Township Stormwater Management Ordinance. I do have a presentation. Just want to confirm that it will be on the screen. I am sharing my screen. Are you in Zoom? Yes.
That's weird, his worked, yours didn't. All right, and you're sharing which one, this one?
Yep.
All right, let's check and see.
I don't think I'm in the same room as.
Yeah, let me do that, yeah, that's what it is. We'll get you in the right one.
Okay, sounds good.
You're in the same room with us, but you're not in the same virtual room with
Exactly. Thank you, everyone, for bearing with us. We appreciate it.
That's all right.
Well, while we're getting everything started, I just want to inform you guys that I will have my phone on me. My wife is 9 months pregnant, so if I do get the call and I run out here, I promise it's not because I don't like you guys. It's because I have important business to take care of. So,
Completely understandable and congratulations.
thank you. Appreciate it. All right.
No, you're in with LMT Production, which is right.
I could back out of the call and
Yeah,
go back
I'll back
in.
you out. I'll back
Okay.
you out. Hold on.
Yep, should be in. There we go. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being patient with us. We appreciate it. So just to reiterate, I'm Jonathan with HRG, and tonight we'll be going through the Stormwater Management Ordinance recommendations for Lower Makefield Township Stormwater Management Ordinance. I believe all of you have been provided HRG's memorandum of recommendations that has more detailed description of our recommendations within it. Tonight, I just want to go over a high-level overview of our recommendations, including the sources that we pulled from, and touching on some of the key components of the ordinance.
Okay, terrific.
So as I mentioned, just a quick agenda of what we're going to go over. We're going to quickly touch on an overview of the ordinance, summarize the sources that we pulled from for the ordinance itself. We'll touch on some of the recommendations, including combining the stormwater management ordinances, model ordinance consistency, as well as some stormwater management practices, and then we will summarize what all we discussed today. And I also want to preface that there is a lot of information in this presentation and also within your memorandum. So if at any point you have questions about something that I am discussing, feel free to jump in. I don't mind you interrupting me. Please do, because I will be talking a lot, and I don't really like that. So I'd be more than happy to have a discussion with you. All right, so a quick overview of the stormwater management ordinance recommendations. HRG's goal is to assist the township in creating a comprehensive and modernized stormwater management ordinance that effectively addresses stormwater quality and quantity management, current construction standards, and promotes the use of innovative best management practices, or BMPs, including low impact development, LID, and green infrastructure, GI. These updates will help mitigate the adverse impacts of unmanaged stormwater on the overall quality of life of the community and enhance resiliency in the face of more frequent and intense storm events. Some of you also may remember that HRG was in discussion with the township for a phase 1 or quick hitter improvements to the stormwater management ordinance. This comprehensive ordinance update will include those phase 1 amendments as well. And then another overall goal of this ordinance revision is for consistency. That would be a consistency with the model ordinances as well as consistency with the other ordinances of Lower Makefield Township, including the subdivision land development ordinance and the zoning ordinance, to name a few. So the sources that we pulled from to derive some of the requirements included within this ordinance are the PADEP model ordinance, the Act 167 model ordinances from the Neshaminy Creek and the Delaware River South, the PADEP BMP manual, and the associated new draft PCSM manual, Lower Makefield Township ordinances, and as well as something that I have not looked at before until reviewing this ordinance was the New Jersey Administrative Code. Since it is right next door to us, I thought it'd be good to include some of their recommendations. And lastly, another source we pulled from was professional experience. So jumping into it, our first recommendation is to combine the stormwater management ordinances. Currently, Lower Makefield Township has 2 stormwater management ordinances. There's the Delaware River South Watershed Ordinance and the Neshaminy Creek Watershed Ordinance. We are simply proposing to combine them into one stormwater management ordinance. And the reasoning behind this is because the current ordinances are very similar to each other. There aren't a lot of clear distinctions between them that would warrant 2 separate ordinances. And then also for simplicity, whenever there may be a developer coming into the township, it would be a lot easier to look at just one ordinance rather than 2 different ones. That goes along with easier to navigate. And to identify the differences between the ordinances, we can provide 2 different tables, especially within the rate control calculation section, to accommodate their differences. Moving along to model ordinance consistency. As I mentioned, there are 2 model ordinances, well, 3 if you include both Act 167 model ordinances, that Lower Makefield Township's ordinance should be in compliance with. First off, we have the PADEP model ordinance. As you can see, there are a couple sections in there that are not included within Lower Makefield Township's current ordinance. There may be some language within the current ordinance that references these sections a little bit, but clearly defining these within the new ordinance will make it clearer in compliance with the model ordinance itself. As you can see, the top line is the LID/green infrastructure language included within the model ordinance. This is actually optional language within the model ordinance, but after discussion with the township, we think that including this language would meet the goals of the ordinance revision. The other ordinance that we would like to be consistent with is the Neshaminy Creek and Delaware River South model ordinances. Again, there are some ordinance sections within here that are not clearly identified within Lower Makefield Township Stormwater Ordinance right now. Again, there may be some verbiage that references some of these sections, but we want to clearly define them within the ordinance so it is clearly in compliance. Along with consistency, we want the new stormwater ordinance to be consistent with Lower Makefield Township's current ordinances. And as I mentioned, specifically the Saldo ordinance, subdivision and land development, and the zoning ordinance. The subdivision and land development ordinance actually has some pretty comprehensive stormwater practices within it, including low impact development, some subsurface investigation and infiltration testing requirements, BMP design criteria, dedication and operation and maintenance requirements, and so forth. We just want to make sure that the stormwater management ordinance itself is consistent with the subdivision and land development ordinance, so we have the same provisions in both of them, especially when it comes to stormwater. The same thing with zoning. The zoning ordinance of Lower Makefield Township has a pretty comprehensive natural resource protection ordinance. This would require developments to protect streams, riparian buffers, floodways, floodplains, ponds, wetlands, steep slopes, woodlands, etc. Any natural resource that requires protection, the zoning ordinance requires that. Again, we just want to confirm that the stormwater management ordinance also reflects those requirements. And something within Lower Makefield Township that is unique is a pervious pavement credit and design criteria. We want to confirm that the stormwater management ordinance encourages applicants to utilize that credit in accordance with the ordinance itself. Some of the biggest differences that would be new to the ordinance rather than compliance with other regulatory requirements or existing ordinances within Lower Makefield Township would be the calculation methodology recommendations that we are proposing within the ordinance. So first off, our first recommendation is calculation adjacent. It is redefining the definition of impervious area. Currently, the definition does not include pools and gravel areas as impervious. Our recommendation is to include pools and gravel areas as impervious. There may be discussion on, if this would increase the variance or zoning requirements for lots and especially residents who have already installed pools. So the zoning ordinance and the stormwater ordinance can have separate definitions for impervious area. So for example, a pool within the zoning ordinance, the water itself may not be considered impervious. But for stormwater calculations, we'll want to consider it impervious for those times during the winter where it is covered and there is actual, runoff coming off the pool and it is acting like impervious area. So there wouldn't be any increase in variances compared to the zoning ordinance, but there will be an increase of stormwater capture for the stormwater ordinance. Yes?
Just make sure, so just gravel down on top of dirt is considered impervious?
Yeah, so right now, the stormwater ordinance, it's kind of a gray area. It states that it is up to the township engineer's discretion on what is considered impervious and not impervious when it comes to gravel or other similar surfaces. So we want to clearly define what is and what isn't, so there isn't a judgment call in there.
Okay.
So just on that same point, I know that over the years, people have come in with proposals for gravel driveways and things of that sort and tried to say they were pervious, and the township's position has always been that they're impervious. I guess that's under zoning. I'm not sure if it must not be under stormwater management, but somewhere in township ordinances, it's already considered impervious, so it would be making it consistent with what exists. The question I have is that something the town wants to do? And is a gravel driveway really impervious? Is it partially pervious? Is there some percentage of it that's pervious? What are your thoughts about that?
Is that directed towards HRG or towards the planning commission?
I guess I'm directing that towards either you or Jim, I mean, or Dan. Just sort of, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so from an engineering side, typically gravel surfaces become very compact over time, especially driveways, and they typically act as impervious area over time. Now, maybe whenever they are first installed, there may be some infiltration from the voids within the stone, but as time goes on, those voids get filled in with dirt, it gets compacted, and then the water does run off as it is, just like an asphalt driveway. But again, as you mentioned, this would be a policy decision, and ultimately it would be up to the township to decide what they would like to enforce and what they would not want to enforce.
Yeah, and Tony, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and, sometimes there's gravel that really isn't necessarily impervious. Like if you had nice pea gravel, like around your house, like is a landscaping feature, it does allow water to go through. It's not readily compactable. But when you're looking at something from, let's say, an aerial photo to try to gather what's impervious and not impervious, for stormwater management calculation purposes, it's just easier to classify it all as impervious. Maybe for zoning purposes, you give credit for that a little bit differently. And, but I think JJ's point is that it kind of, it just makes life simpler when you're calculating it that way.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah. But there is that slight thing between zoning and stormwater management ordinance impervious that we have to sort out a little bit on our
That's
end.
That's a good clarification, though, like there's two different things we're really talking about there.
Yeah, and I think we just have to change the wording slightly, probably in zoning.
Gotcha.
The other thing that I was thinking about here is we've had credit for pervious pavement, and we've encouraged it, and it has worked well in some cases, but does have maintenance element. Would defined pervious pavement be considered pervious, or would it be in the impervious in this ordinance?
Yeah, that's a good question. As the ordinance is written right now, it would be considered impervious. That is my understanding of it. However, if the township wishes for it to have some sort of pervious, component to it, we could build that into the definition as well.
I'm just thinking we'd want to, this gets to the harmonization question. We've encouraged pervious pavement, oh gosh, it's got to be 7 or 8 years ago we had an ordinance, Jim, you might remember. And we have it in some locations, most notably at the Makefield School. And it's really cool to watch. I don't know if you've ever seen it. So, and that we would all agree is pervious from water penetrating and going in. So we want to encourage that, I think. But it does have, maintenance requirements associated with it.
Yeah, we could possibly, as I understand it, there is, a separate pervious pavement ordinance. We could build in the definition that if impervious area is built in accordance to the pervious pavement ordinance and it meets those requirements, then it can be considered pervious compared to impervious.
Sounds like built and maintained, based on.
Yeah.
Based on your comment, the language should be built and maintained according to the
Yep.
pervious requirements.
Because the same thing with pervious pavement, and it's the same thing with gravel.
Yeah.
If it is not properly
same,
maintained, then
yeah,
it'll,
same, that's the same
voids will
stuff.
get filled in and it'll act as impervious.
Yep.
Yeah. Our zoning ordinance gives a 50% credit for porous pavement or permeable pavement, and there are design standards, maintenance requirements built into that. And currently, that zoning ordinance provision is only applicable to non-residential ones. I think the concern with residential is that an individual person is less likely in future ownership to follow the rules because they don't read the deed, they don't read the restrictions, whereas a corporate entity, non-residential, institutional, commercial, they're more likely to read the fine print before they buy things and before they do things. That was the justification behind it.
Sounds good. We'll be cognizant of that as we go through our complete rewrite of the ordinance. Maybe if it's not in the definition, there is definitely some sort of provision we need to include that encompasses the pervious pavement ordinance to make sure there is that credit, 50% credit for non-residential construction. Any other questions about the impervious area definition so far? Nope. Sounds good. Some other calculation methodology we'd like to introduce to the stormwater management ordinance are some time of concentration guidelines. So that typically applies to your rate control calculations. Basically, how long does the water take from the uppermost point of a drainage area to get to your stormwater management facility or your point of interest? By adding some guidelines in there, we avoid avoid developers from artificially inflating your post-development time of concentration. What that means is if you increase your post-development or your construction time of concentration, that would make the runoff get to your point of interest slower, which would then artificially decrease your rate compared to what it may actually be in actual post-development conditions. So that was kind of some heady stormwater stuff, but all in reality, we're avoiding developers from taking advantage of time of concentration calculations. Same thing with the next provision would be disallowing, quote, meadow cover conditions in post-development calculations. Again, this is mainly to increase the amount of stormwater capture from proposed BMPs or stormwater management facilities within the township.
And would you use lawn then instead of meadow?
Correct, yes. For number 4, we would revise the peak rate control requirements. This is actually a provision that was from the NJAC, the New Jersey Administrative Code. So typically in Pennsylvania, how you handle peak rate control requirements is your peak from your pre-development has to be higher than your post-development, or in other words, your post-development peak rate must be lower than your pre-development. And typically how rates are shown in stormwater calculations are through like a hydrograph, or if you think of it in simple terms, like a bell curve. You know, you have your bell curve, the top is your peak. In New Jersey, what they require is the entirety of your bell curve to be lower than the bell curve of your pre-development. So rather than just, you know, you're looking at your peaks, you're looking at the entirety of your storm. So in New Jersey, it requires the entire storm to be less than your pre-development and post-development conditions. Any questions on that? Again, some pretty in-depth stormwater calculations.
So that means that if you build a new anything,
Yep.
that post that development, the ability to address stormwater will be improved
Correct.
regardless, okay.
Correct. Yeah, and another good thing about this requirement is that it encourages developers to mimic existing conditions as much as possible. Because the only way for your curves, your hydrographs, your curves to line up is if your existing is pretty close to your proposed conditions. So this encourages developers to, you know, utilize existing hydrology on their sites.
And there's no issue with using New Jersey versus PA since we're in Pennsylvania?
No, so this requirement is greater than Pennsylvania's.
Okay.
So there's no concern in increasing requirements compared to Pennsylvania. You just can't go below the standards. All right, number 5, or the 5th bullet point, we would add stormwater runoff quality standards. So the current ordinance has a quantity standard, that would be your volume and maybe even your rate control. But now we're going to be introducing a quality standard, which would require developers to provide a calculation that shows they are reducing total suspended solids within their post-development stormwater calculations. PADP has a pretty neat spreadsheet that automatically calculates this for you. So if they utilize PADEP's guidelines, this should be pretty easy to fulfill. The next one is including tailwater conditions for stormwater management calculations. In simple terms, whenever there is a pipe entering a basin or a floodway, whenever it eventually fills up, there's water that backs up into the pipe. We just want to confirm that that calculation and assumption is included in future stormwater management considerations. And lastly, we are recommending to remove the rational method calculation methodology from the stormwater management ordinance. Some people may think that this calculation methodology is simpler and easier to utilize. However, it is not as accurate as, quote, the SCS method, which is the standard method of stormwater management calculations. So we are recommending to utilize that method to better mimic actual on-site stormwater runoff. Any questions on the calculation methodology? Yes.
Yeah, Jonathan, before you back up.
Yep.
If we could back up a little bit onto that, the tailwater conditions for calculations. Just curious, how often does that happen, or is it like acceptable for that to happen where it backs up into the pipe?
Yeah, so I would say it's actually pretty common whenever you are discharging a storm sewer system into a basin. Typically, whenever you get to your 10, 25, 50, 100-year storms, your water elevation within the basin is going to be higher than the pipe within the basin itself. So in your larger developments, it's pretty common. Maybe for a smaller residential stormwater facility, it may not be as common, but I would say it's fairly often, I should say.
So as storms, as we appear to be having more intense storms, should the level of storm that ends up creating a tailwater condition, should that be raised? So instead of it being what's now considered a 10-year storm, should we be looking at 25-year storms?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think tailwater is bad in itself. It's just confirming that it's included in the calculations. If that condition is included in the calculations itself and it doesn't affect, backup in the rest of the stormwater system, then I don't believe there is a necessity to increase or provide a recommendation on when tailwater should be encountered.
Okay, I guess I was stating that the wrong way. Does it mean we should do more for the basin itself? If the backups are occurring more frequently with more intense storms, should we do more to improve the ability of the basins to handle the water so that it handles a 10-year storm better or a 25-year storm better?
Yeah, that's a good question. Within our recommendations for the stormwater management ordinance, as I mentioned previously, we are going to include stormwater facility design standards within the ordinance, so that may address some of your concerns for these basins, and we will make sure they are in compliance with the most recent recommendations from the draft PCSM manual that PADEP published earlier this year.
Okay, terrific, thanks.
Yep. Yes.
If I could, So one thing I'm thinking about here is this involves only new development or redevelopment
Correct.
property. If we have a circumstance where we're unable to meet the stormwater management in the event of, because we are seeing increased storms, is the revised peak rate control requirements, do they need to be potentially even more strict, or are we okay based on what's your assessment of what you've seen analyzing, our current flood maps and recent events?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in our Phase 1 recommendations, we did reduce the peak rate control requirement to 80% of the peak rate. So we'll make sure to carry that over into the comprehensive ordinance amendment. And I believe that 80% reduction, in addition to the entirety of the post-development hydrograph being less than pre-development, is going way above and beyond any other stormwater management ordinance that I've worked on. So it will definitely do its part in reducing stormwater in the post-development conditions for new development and redevelopment as well.
So that would make it the, I don't want to say most strict, but would it be, in your mind, one of the most strict ordinances in Pennsylvania, and if not the area?
I can say it is the most strict ordinance that I have worked on personally.
Okay.
I don't have the information to say, relatively to all of Pennsylvania, but for me personally, yes, it is the most strict I've written and worked on. Any other questions regarding calculation methodology? Nope. All right. And last but not least, just want to quickly touch on some general requirements and recommendations we are looking at introducing into the ordinance itself. So first off, we'll be looking to update some of the stormwater management site plan submission requirements, and associated with that would be the stormwater management report submission requirements. Mainly, the reasoning behind this is to add additional information into the plans and reports so it's easier for review from the township side as well as the township engineers. We will also be looking to update stormwater management easement requirements to make sure they coincide with the land development ordinance. Looking to expand upon inspection procedures and create a template inspection report for residents to complete whenever they are inspecting their own BMPs. Prohibit dumping and open storage of pollutants. Updating the small project stormwater management site plan. This is for your residents who may be adding a small amount of impervious area to make sure it's easier for them to follow. Updating hotspot BMP practices and providing additional requirements for known stormwater management problem areas. Any questions on those requirements? All right, so in summary, HRG's recommendations to the ordinance are to make it regulatory compliant. That is compliant with PADEP's model ordinance, as well as the Act 167 plans within Lower Makefield Township. We're also making these ordinance revisions to make the ordinance consistent with other Lower Makefield Township ordinances, including the zoning ordinance and subdivision land development ordinance. We also believe these updates will make the ordinance simple and practical while also modernizing the ordinance itself. Last but not least, we believe these recommendations will make the Lower Makefield Township Stormwater Management Ordinance more resilient and sustainable to future and ever-changing stormwater concerns that may be encountered in the future. Any questions?
I guess first wanted to thank you for your presentation. But I guess the big question is, what's your expectation about when the updates to the ordinance will be available?
Yeah, that's a good question. I may deflect that to Jim and Dan. I guess it depends on, if you would like us to discuss this anymore with other public entities. But our thought is that by the fall/early winter, we would like the ordinance to be adopted. You should see a draft earlier than that, maybe late summer to early fall.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and Tony, we actually invited members of the EAC to come to the meeting and/or tune in. I see we have Kevin Gollan from the EAC is here in person. A few other members couldn't make it, but they will be reviewing the tape to go over it. And if they have any questions, I told them to feel free to reach out to us to maybe get some further clarification if needed. But I think all in all, this is sort of right in line with what the township's thinking is to, as you pointed out, modernize our ordinance, clarify some inconsistencies, go with a more modern standard for stormwater management, then go even a little bit above and beyond that to make our ordinance just more better. Poor language, but
I
you
agree.
got it.
And again, the memorandum that was provided to the Planning Commission as well as the EAC should have a more detailed description of each of our recommendations. I will also put the caveat that as we are doing the comprehensive rewrite of the ordinance, there may be some additional recommendations we may have, but we'll make sure to highlight those as we provide our first draft.
So that was a question I had. You said you wanted to make the ordinance more consistent with the zoning and subdivision land development. Are there any recommendations in those two ordinances that need to change? Because that would obviously need a different.
Yeah, that's a good
ordinance and
question.
different provision, so.
Other than the impervious area definition that we previously discussed, I don't think so. I believe the subdivision and land development ordinance and the zoning ordinance are fairly comprehensive. As we're going through the rewrites, we'll make sure to note if there are any inconsistencies we may see or any updates that we would recommend.
One other question I just thought
Yes.
of. There's the stormwater maintenance and operations agreement.
Mhm.
You know, if you ever took a look at that, obviously some changes might need to be done to the model agreement that the township uses.
For sure, we'll take a look at that as well.
Yeah, and I think that it's not bad, but I always thought it needed a little bit of tweaking, and I'm sure the DEP and/or you during your review will find a few things that should just be just tightened a little bit.
Yeah. I personally haven't read through the agreement itself, but PADEP does have a model agreement, which I would assume is very similar to the one Lower Makefield Township has. But if there are any recommendations that you've seen, Jim, that you would like us to include in it, we'd be more than happy to do so.
Yeah, the model agreement we have is the 20-year-old DEP model agreement,
Okay.
which I kind of know has been updated.
Yeah.
Nothing major, but it still would be great to have the latest, greatest with
Sounds good.
going forward.
Actually caused me to think of a question. Occasionally in the SALDO process, the Board of Supervisors offers waivers to developers. Is there a way that the ordinance can be structured such that waivers are not allowed or are paid out or however? Basically, you want to make sure, and we've had this with other ordinances where the developer's attorney comes in and says, "Phew, your ordinances are way too," and I'm not mentioning anybody in specific, the people that wear the Coogee sweaters, I'm not mentioning them. But they say, well, we don't want to pay your outlandish fees, and they're starting negotiations with, well, you're going to waive that for us, right? And then we have to say, no, you have to pay the fee, or you need to pay, you put the sidewalk in, these are requirements. Is there any way we can place in the ordinance that these are non-waivable in SALDO agreements?
I don't think I'm in a position to provide
Well, you're
legal
not
advice on
Yeah,
that.
I'm going to say no, as that
Okay.
it's really up to the township. I don't want to say it's up to the township's discretion. They have to prove a hardship if we're going to grant a waiver.
Right.
So unless they don't prove that hardship, township can just deny the waiver request.
Mhm.
So it's more of an internal thing, just maybe need to be a little bit harsher and stricter with the developers.
Maybe to your point, put language in there that says any waiver that's given needs a public review.
Well, technically, the
Yeah.
seller process is a
Yeah,
public
yeah,
Yeah,
review.
when they're asking
Yeah,
for.
I guess I don't know the.
When they're asking for waivers, I mean, it is gonna be mentioned, they're gonna draft a list of the waivers, the engineer's gonna
Yeah,
weigh
sure.
in whether they
Yeah.
think the waiver's necessary or required.
Because I
Planning commission will have a
understand
chance to look at it, and
That's a
and
good
the supervisors will have a chance to look at it.
Yeah,
It's a really good question what you're asking.
yeah,
It's the sustainability, you want to make sure what you're trying to execute now in this remote reviewed, that when all of us are living down in Florida or wherever
we
we are.
won't be a Florida
Yeah, or
first.
Poconos or wherever, but when we're
Yeah.
not here,
Yeah.
that this still is a viable, working document with teeth.
Yeah, is there a way to which, I guess we can't, that you have to give, I guess, the offer of a waiver. There may be technical circumstances that we're not aware of where, I hate to use the word taking, because it seems to be a word that some folks use, but there may be unique circumstances, and I just want to make sure that those are extraordinarily limited, and the township gets compensated in some way for that waiver, at a rate far more than it costs for us to give that waiver.
Yeah, I think at this point, maybe it's just more of a policy thing that internally we can
Yeah.
look at.
I'm with you.
Yeah,
I'm with you.
yeah, anybody who asks for a waiver must review all the documents from the July 15th flood, including all the videos, and they must see pictures of what happened, you know? Yeah,
Yeah, I'm
So-
with you 100%.
yeah,
You know, the ordinance can be drafted as strictly as possible, but ultimately, it's going to come down to how future Board of Supervisors operates.
yeah,
I
no,
mean, look at the ordinance that we just talked about before this one, the shed ordinance, which is uniformly ignored or often ignored by residents, and if it's not ignored, they get a waiver. They get zoning relief. So it really comes down to enforcement and not giving relief to whatever ordinance is drafted now as a result of this. And that's going to be based on what future boards and future zoning boards do.
Sounds good. Any other questions regarding the stormwater management ordinance recommendations? If not, any public comment?
Is there any public comment?
anybody on the phone?
I don't see the red light on.
Oh,
John, thank you very much. Good luck.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yep, thanks.
thanks.
Thank you, congratulations.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, we just added that the last meeting.
Okay, I don't believe there are any other items on our agenda, but under other business, Adrian, you had raised something earlier today. I don't know if you want to address that now.
Yeah, like, why not? I just, all I asked is a question. I was driving over the Stony Hill Bridge coming from Township Line Road, and I noticed that the little barricade for the walking path was gone, but there's no, like that says it's not ready to go, but there's no curb, no separator from the road. It just looks like a shoulder. And so I just sent a message out saying, hey, I thought I remembered, which I think I'm correct. I think I talked to Jim later. That we had a discussion that there was going to be some protection and separation between the walking path on that bridge and the road. And that's what I just asked, what's up with that?
Yeah, and I know when they first approached PennDOT about putting in the barricade, they went back and forth a few times, and then PennDOT had some concerns about the bridge and how it's attached to the bridge, and they spent several months working through how the barricade would actually be on the bridge. And they finally got that all squared away, got the contracts all let, got all the approvals in place. And according to the press release from PennDOT, they were supposed to have started work on the bridge last night. And hopefully they'll have that barricade up within the next month, and then they'll be finishing up little tie-in work and everything like that. There's a lot that they have to do with it that's a lot more than they originally anticipated, which if it gives PennDOT what they need to maintain the structural integrity of the bridge, I'm all for that.
Okay, yeah. That was the, no, that was a question I asked, because I remembered we talked about it, and that was the answer that you hoped for, so.
Jim,
Thank you.
Adrian, thank you for bringing it up, and Jim, thanks for getting an answer. There was a belief in the community, and wasn't totally unfounded, that the developer had sought relief from PennDOT to avoid having to do what they agreed to do previously with regard to the bridge. So it's all good that it's happening.
Great.
At this point, is there, I take it there's no other business, and is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion?
Second?
Second.
Third.
All in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned. See you guys next month.
All right.